there's this problem here. Mariak has a great line. There's a longer quote, but I'll just read part of it. We can write the life of a saint, but it is impossible to imagine writing a novel about a saint, that is, creating a saint. So there's this idea that it's a step too far for a novelist to imagine a saint because the life of grace cannot be. I don't know. There's something about saints that are sui generis, and so I don't remember his full reasoning, but to my mind, it's something like that a saint is something that is so purely the province and the creation of God, and much less so of his. It's like the creation of the soul's holiness by God is something that outweighs all of the circumstances and all of the external drama in the person that you could portray, such that a novelist cannot invent it because it's the sort of thing that can only be even imagined by God, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at the sort of the birth of fiction, some thinkers like Osip Mandelstam argue that that fiction, sort of so to speak, kind of secular fiction, was a kind of response to or a departure from lives of the saints and moral sketches and moral tales, and there was this sort of turn inward into an exploration of human psychological motivation and a movement away from this sort of grand and broad cosmos that would include the movements of God. um, but then you also have sort of corrections to that, because I think of someone like J.K. Huysmans, who is a Catholic convert who was a Satanist at one point, actually, in the sort of Parisian underworld, and he converted to Catholicism. And he wrote, after he converted, he was a sort of novelist by trade, but he wrote a life of Saint Ludwina. And he brought a sort of novelist's sensibility to that life, because he says that when he read the other pre-existing sort of hagiographies of Lidwina, they gave you a Lidwina that was sort of totally inhuman, if that makes sense, right? So focused on saccharine and flowery representations that they weren't willing to acknowledge that she too had undergone a conversion. And when he did a little bit of digging, he found that here was a saint who, even after God was giving her this sort of profound invitation to redemptively suffer with him, she wanted nothing to do with it. And he does that part of her life justice by getting into that sort of fallenness before he moves into her profound heroism, right? In being a sort of sight of the suffering of Christ continued in history. Um, and so I think that actually I think Moriak takes it too far. He actually says in an essay called God and Mammon that he has Jansenist tendencies. And I think it comes through in those kinds of statements where he sort of really heavy-handedly says you can't represent good people. I mean, I think that Dostoevsky does it with Father Zosima very compellingly. I think he does it less compellingly with Prince Mishkin and the Idiot, and I think he himself saw it as a kind of a good, maybe it's an interesting novel, but a failed experiment at representing a good soul. Um, but then you have a number of different Catholic writers, Rumer Gaudens in This House of Breed, who represents, good souls in ordinary ways. And they're also sinners, but they're also, they're good. They're not sort of these grotesquely wicked figures like Raskolnikov or the misfit in Flannery O'Connor, right? I mean, I think we got to get away from the idea that that's the sort of the heart of the Catholic imagination or something like that. That's one manifestation of it. But and I would go even further than that and say, think about the novels of Jane Austen. Now, here we have representations of just natural virtue. We also have representations of natural vice and of kind of self-delusion. But there's also movement towards natural virtue more than there is, let's say, religious conversion in those novels. And she pulls it off successfully because it's extremely compelling, right? You have to follow Elizabeth Bennet through kind of, she's swinging from the pendulum of self-deceit to a kind of epiphanic knowledge of herself, right, by the end of the novel. And no one would say that that's like a failed representation of a person who's moving towards goodness, right?
even though Aquinas says that, the virtue of art doesn't depend on the rectitude of the appetite, I have to think that um, there's, plenty of Catholic novels who were profoundly flawed or out, you mentioned why being, we can just say he was not a very good person for a lot of his life, um, have managed to represent conversion
Mm.
compellingly. But to represent something more like the life of holiness, and I'm talking about in a fictionalized
Mm.
way where you're not relying primarily on something that like a real saint's life or something like
Right,
that,
right.
um, which even non-Catholics have been able to do compellingly, when when they were able to rely on a real life, Um,
Yeah.
but I have to imagine that that's one area where personal experience is necessary,
Mm-hmm.
where you have to and probably you can't even just have known a holy person because you have to be able to know these people from the
I think
inside,
that's right.
and so I would think that being a saint would make it easier to
Oh yeah.
do that. I think there's probably things that are, even though it's art, yes, it's art, it's not life, are just going to be inaccessible to the novelist unless he's personally experienced
No,
it.
I think that's absolutely right, and I don't mean to suggest that someone who is, profoundly sinful can't represent someone who is profoundly good, because I think that's one of the amazing sort of mysteries of the human imagination, that really,
Hmm.
really bad people can represent really good people in their fiction. But
Yes.
I think that you're right, and I think that what you're getting at here, in other words, is that these it's important for us to move away from a kind of overemphasis on purifying the source just so that we can represent evil properly, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
that,
Right. Right.
and
Right.
again,
Right.
I think
Yeah.
there's reason for that the conversation tends in that direction, because I really do think it's true that literature gravitates toward representation of evil. That's just historically true. I think it's maybe even like sort of metaphysically, ontologically true of the form or something, right? That's what it
Hmm.
gravitates toward. But still, it doesn't just do that, right? And as Maritain says, right, only a mystic can be a complete novelist. And part of what that means is that only a mystic knows that when they're representing rebellion, that it's not just a sort of psychological tick, or a rebellion against the father or something like that. It's a rebellion against God, right? And so part of it
Yeah.
is that, but it's also because the mystic knows that when the human soul is transformed by grace, that there is a beatification that happens. There's an increase in holiness, and human beings are made to be able to achieve, so to speak, through grace, this high level of goodness that seems impossible, right? And I think that it would seem incredible, meaning like non-credible, to most of us. And that's why, a lot of people, when they encounter lives of the saints, I think they say, I don't really like reading the life of Saint Teresa of Avila, because it just makes me sort of feel bad about myself or something like that, right? I mean, I'm sympathetic to some extent that that would be the initial response. But of course, the proper response is to say, oh my God. And I mean that not in a blasphemy, like literally, oh my God, you are a good God, because look what you have done with this human soul. You have transformed this human soul so wonderfully, right? And I'm able
Hmm.
to sort of get a little bit of a taste into those heights of conversion that I may never
Hmm.
experience in this lifetime.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even more, you would want to actually be inspired to
Oh,
get there in
oh,
this
for
lifetime.
sure.
That
Yeah,
is the
no,
goal.
absolutely. Yeah.
I never liked that when people talk about like, oh well, the saints are the saints, and
Yeah.
we'll never have that in our lifetime. Well, it's like, well, that's up to you. You know.
Right. 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 Yeah.
Uh,
There's no sure way to kill Christianity. You know what I mean?
right.
Yeah. That's a
Because
that's a sure recipe to eradicate
yeah,
Christianity from the face of the earth.
yeah.